The dust stirred on the worn path leading to the Barkley homestead as Cassidy Benson watched her life crumble for the second time in less than a year. 3 men in black suits stood on her porch, their expressions a mixture of false sympathy and bureaucratic indifference as they handed her the foreclosure notice. Montana Territory, 1878, was unforgiving to a 23-year-old widow with no family and a mountain of her late husband's debts. "You have 2 weeks, Mrs. Benson," the tallest one said, folding his papers with practiced precision. "The bank is being generous considering the circumstances." Generous. The word tasted like bitter medicine. Cassidy's fingers crumpled the notice as the men tipped their hats and departed. The small ranch had been her husband Thomas's dream, not hers. But in the 6 months since his death from pneumonia, it had become her only anchor in a world determined to set her adrift. Inside the modest cabin, Cassidy sank into the chair Thomas had crafted during their first year of marriage. 2 weeks to settle debts that would take 2 lifetimes to pay. 2 weeks before she would join the growing number of destitute women in Silver Creek who survived by taking in laundry, serving meals, or worse. The following morning dawned with merciless brightness. Cassidy rose before the sun, her resolve hardened overnight. There was only one option: sell everything that wasn't essential and use the money to secure passage east to her distant cousin in Boston, a woman she'd never met, but who had once corresponded with Cassidy's mother. By midday, Cassidy had loaded a wagon with items to sell in town. The furniture Thomas had made, the wedding china they'd never used, and books she'd read so many times the pages were soft as cloth. Each item placed in the wagon felt like another piece of herself being torn away. Silver Creek's main street was busy with the usual midweek traffic when Cassidy arrived. Cowboys from neighboring ranches mingled with merchants, while saloon girls called from second-story balconies. She navigated toward Porter's General Store, hoping Jacob Porter might purchase her goods outright. "Mrs. Benson." Jacob greeted her with genuine warmth. The older shopkeeper had always been kind. "What brings you to town with all this?" "The bank is taking the ranch, Mr. Porter," Cassidy said, keeping her voice steady. "I need to sell whatever I can to buy passage east." Jacob's face fell. "I'm so sorry, my dear. Thomas was a good man. This shouldn't have happened to you." "But it has," she replied simply. "Can you help me?" As Jacob examined her items, the store's bell jangled. Cassidy glanced up to see a tall man enter, his broad shoulders nearly filling the doorframe. Dust coated his leather vest and denim pants, and a week's worth of beard shadowed his jaw. Unlike most cowboys who came to town for revelry, this one moved with quiet purpose, his eyes serious beneath the brim of a well-worn hat. "Dawson, good timing," Jacob called. "Got those supplies you ordered?" The cowboy Dawson nodded in acknowledgement, his gaze briefly meeting Cassidy's before moving back to Jacob. "Appreciate it. Reynolds needs those fence posts by tomorrow." Cassidy turned away, focusing on negotiating with Jacob. The figures he offered were fair, but dismally insufficient. Even selling everything, she would barely have enough for the stagecoach fare, let alone a new start in Boston. "That's everything I can manage, Mrs. Benson," Jacob said apologetically, counting out bills. "Times are hard all around." "I understand," Cassidy said, though understanding did nothing to fill the hollow feeling spreading through her chest. As she gathered her payment, the cowboy approached, having completed his own transaction. Up close, she noticed his eyes were the color of a summer sky, startlingly bright against his sun-darkened skin. "Mrs. Benson," he said, tipping his hat. "I'm Dawson Jenkins, foreman at the R. Couldn't help overhearing about your situation." Cassidy stiffened. "My situation is none of your concern, Mr. Jenkins." If her coldness surprised him, he didn't show it. "The R is looking for a cook. Owner's wife just had their 4th child, and she can't manage the house and the ranch hands meals anymore. Pays good, includes room and board." "I don't need charity, Mr. Jenkins," Cassidy replied sharply. A flicker of something amusement perhaps crossed his features. "It's not charity if you're working, madam. And from what I've heard about your apple pies at last year's Harvest Festival, you'd be doing us the favor." Before Cassidy could respond, he placed a card on the counter between them. "Think it over. Ranch is 7 miles north. Job's yours if you want it." He tipped his hat again and departed, leaving Cassidy staring at the simple card with R Ranch and a crude map sketched on the back. You should consider it, Jacob said quietly. The Reynolds family is good people, and it would give you time to plan your next move without rushing east with barely $1 to your name. I don't know these people, Cassidy said, though she slipped the card into her pocket. And I've had enough of depending on others' goodwill. Jacob's eyes softened with understanding. Sometimes accepting help isn't weakness, Cassidy. It's just good sense. That evening, alone in the homestead that would soon belong to strangers, Cassidy spread her meager earnings on the kitchen table. Jacob was right, it wasn't enough. Not nearly enough. She pulled the triple R card from her pocket, running her thumb over the rough edges. Cooking for ranch hands wasn't how she'd imagined her life. But then, neither was widowhood at 23. The next morning, Cassidy loaded her remaining possessions into the wagon. Whatever she couldn't take with her, she left behind with notes for Jacob to sell and send the money to her when he could. The ranch and its contents would satisfy some of Thomas's debts, but not all. She would carry that burden wherever she went. The Triple R Ranch sprawled across a verdant valley, its white painted buildings gleaming in the morning sun. A main house, a bunkhouse, various outbuildings, and sturdy corrals spoke of prosperity that the Barkley homestead had never achieved. As Cassidy's wagon approached, a woman emerged from the main house, wiping her hands on her apron. Petite with dark hair streaked with silver, she waved warmly. "You must be Mrs. Benson," she called. "I'm Margaret Reynolds. We've been hoping you'd come." Cassidy drew the wagon to a stop, suddenly uncertain. "Mr. Jenkins mentioned you needed a cook." Desperately, Margaret confirmed with a smile. "Between the children and helping my husband with the books, I'm stretched thinner than water in a drought. Come inside, please." Before Cassidy could respond, Dawson Jenkins emerged from a nearby barn. Seeing the wagon, he approached, that same quiet intensity in his movements. "Mrs. Benson," he greeted her. "Glad you decided to come." "I haven't decided anything yet," Cassidy corrected him firmly. "I'm here to discuss the position." Margaret shot Dawson a look that seemed to communicate something Cassidy couldn't interpret. "Of course," Margaret said. "Let's get you settled first. You've had a long journey." The main house was spacious and welcoming, with well-worn furniture and the happy chaos that comes with children. Margaret showed Cassidy to a small but comfortable bedroom at the back of the house, connected to the kitchen. "This would be yours," Margaret explained. "The men eat in the bunkhouse, you'd prepare their meals here, and my oldest boy would help carry them over. 3 meals a day, with Sundays lighter as some men go into town." "And the compensation?" Cassidy asked, determined to keep this discussion businesslike. $20 a month, plus room and board," Margaret replied. "It's not a fortune, but it's honest work." It was fair, better than fair, actually. Cassidy had expected less. "I should mention I have no experience cooking for large groups." Margaret smiled. "Can you make biscuits that don't break teeth and stew that has more meat than water? That's all these cowboys really care about." For the first time in days, Cassidy felt a small lightening of her spirits. "I can manage that." "Excellent." Margaret clasped her hands together. "When can you start?" Cassidy hesitated. Everything was moving too quickly. "I need to think about it. This wasn't my plan." Margaret's expression softened. "Of course. Take your time. Stay for dinner at least. Meet the family properly." Cassidy agreed, if only because she had nowhere else to go immediately. As Margaret showed her around the kitchen, explaining the routines and expectations, Cassidy found herself warming to the older woman's practical kindness. The Reynolds family dinner that evening was a boisterous affair. John Reynolds, a broad-shouldered man with laugh lines around his eyes, welcomed Cassidy warmly. Their 4 children, ranging from a teenager to an infant, filled the dining room with chatter and occasional squabbles. To Cassidy's surprise, Dawson Jenkins joined them at the table, apparently a regular guest rather than just an employee. He spoke little, mainly responding to John's questions about ranch operations or the children's eager stories. But Cassidy felt his eyes on her occasionally, assessing in a way that made her uncomfortable. "So, Mrs. Benson," John said as the meal wound down, "Margaret tells me you're considering our offer." "I am," Cassidy replied carefully. "Though I should be honest, I was planning to leave the territory entirely. This would only be temporary." John nodded thoughtfully. "Fair enough. We're not asking for a lifetime commitment. Just someone reliable for as long as you're here." "And if we're lucky," Margaret added with a smile, We might convince you to stay longer." After dinner, Cassidy stepped onto the porch for air. The sun was setting, painting the distant mountains in shades of purple and gold. It was beautiful, she had to admit that. Different from the view at her homestead, but beautiful nonetheless. "Different perspective out here." Dawson's voice came from behind her. He leaned against the porch railing, his profile silhouetted against the sunset. "Sometimes a change of view helps clarify things." "Are you always this philosophical, Mr. Jenkins?" Cassidy asked, not bothering to hide her irritation at his intrusion. The corner of his mouth lifted slightly. "Only when I'm trying to convince stubborn widows to take jobs they clearly need." Cassidy bristled. "You know nothing about what I need. I know the bank's taking your land. I know you were about to flee east with barely enough money for the journey, let alone a new start." His voice remained even, not unkind but unflinching. "And I know you're too proud to admit when help might be the sensible option. Why do you care?" The question burst from her before she could stop it. "You don't know me." Dawson was quiet for a moment, watching the sunset. "My sister was widowed young. Too proud to accept help, too. Ended up in a situation no woman should face." He turned to look at her directly. "Sometimes strangers are just friends you haven't met yet, Mrs. Benson." With that, he tipped his hat and left her alone with her thoughts and the fading light. Cassidy spent a restless night in the comfortable guest bed. By morning, she had made her decision. She would stay temporarily, just long enough to save proper money for her journey east. 3 months, perhaps 4 at most. When she announced her decision at breakfast, Margaret beamed and John nodded approvingly. Dawson, passing through with a cup of coffee, simply gave her a knowing look that Cassidy pointedly ignored. The transition to life at Triple R happened swiftly. Within days, Cassidy established her routine, rising before dawn to prepare breakfast for the ranch hands, spending mornings baking bread and preparing lunch, afternoons planning and starting dinner. The work was demanding but straightforward, and the ranch hands were polite, if somewhat awkward around her at first. Dawson Jenkins proved to be an enigma. As foreman, he maintained a professional distance with the other hands, taking his meals separately more often than not. He was unfailingly polite to Cassidy, but seldom engaged in casual conversation. Yet she often felt his watchful gaze when he thought she wasn't looking. 2 weeks into her stay, disaster struck in the kitchen. Attempting to prepare a stew for 20 hungry men, Cassidy misjudged the seasonings. The result was barely edible, so spicy it brought tears to the eyes. "Might need to adjust the pepper next time, Mrs. Benson," one of the older hands said kindly as he returned his mostly full bowl. Mortified, Cassidy spent the evening making extra bread and opening preserves as a poor substitute. She was still cleaning up, fighting back frustrated tears, when Dawson entered the kitchen. "Come to comment on my failure?" she asked, not turning around. "Actually, I came to say thank you," he replied. This surprised her enough that she faced him. "For what?" "Burning everyone's mouths." A rare smile crossed his features. "For trying something different. The men have been eating the same 5 meals for years. A little excitement at the dinner table isn't the worst thing." Cassidy couldn't help her short laugh. "Excitement is one word for it. Tomorrow's another day," he said simply. Then, to her surprise, he rolled up his sleeves. "Need help with those dishes?" "I couldn't ask you to, you didn't ask." I offered. He was already reaching for a towel. "I've been drying dishes since I was tall enough to reach the counter. My mother wouldn't tolerate idle hands." They worked in surprisingly comfortable silence for several minutes before Cassidy's curiosity got the better of her. "How long have you worked for the Reynolds family?" "Going on 8 years now," Dawson replied. "Started as just another hand, worked my way up. John's a good man to work for, treats his people fair. And before that," Dawson's hands slowed momentarily. "Bit of everything. Army for a while. Drove cattle. Broke horses." He glanced at her. "What about you? Before you were Mrs. Benson?" Cassidy rarely spoke of her past, but something about the quiet kitchen and his undemanding presence loosened her tongue. "I grew up in Kansas. My father was a schoolteacher. After he died, my mother and I struggled. When I was 19, Thomas Benson came through town working as a surveyor. He was kind, had dreams of a ranch in Montana Territory." She shrugged slightly. 3 months later we were married and heading west." "You loved him," Dawson observed. "I respected him," Cassidy corrected carefully. "He was a good man." "The love. I thought it would grow with time. And did it? The question was personal, perhaps too personal, but in the dimly lit kitchen with only the clink of dishes between them, honesty felt safer than it usually did. We were partners, she said finally. Maybe that's its own kind of love. Dawson nodded, accepting her answer without judgment. Thank you for sharing that with me. Later, lying in bed, Cassidy puzzled over the conversation. She hadn't spoken so openly about Thomas to anyone before. Something about Dawson Jenkins made her guard drop, if only slightly. The realization was unsettling. The following weeks established a rhythm to life at Triple R. Cassidy's cooking improved as she learned the men's preferences and adjusted to cooking in larger quantities. Margaret's children, especially 10-year-old Alice, began seeking her company, asking questions about her life back east, as they referred to anywhere beyond Montana. One Saturday afternoon, as Cassidy was hanging laundry, she spotted Dawson working with a spirited young mare in the corral. His movements were patient, gentle but firm as he introduced the animal to a saddle for what appeared to be the first time. He has a way with the difficult ones, Margaret said, appearing beside Cassidy with a basket of wet sheets. John says Dawson could gentle a tornado if he set his mind to it. He seems very patient, Cassidy agreed, trying to sound casual. Margaret smiled knowingly. Patience is his special gift. You should see him with the children, especially when they're being most impossible. She began hanging a sheet. Did you know he teaches little Alice to read? Has her reading from the newspaper every Sunday after church. Cassidy hadn't known that. The image of the serious foreman sitting patiently with the energetic Alice was unexpectedly touching. He's a good man, Margaret continued. Never married, though not for lack of interested parties in town. Mrs. Reynolds, Cassidy said firmly, I'm not interested in Mr. Jenkins' marital status. Margaret laughed softly. Of course not, dear. I'm just making conversation. But later, as Cassidy chopped vegetables for the evening meal, she found herself thinking about Dawson's patience with horses, with children, with her own defensiveness. It was a quality Thomas had lacked, always rushing toward his next big plan. The first month at Triple R passed quickly, then the second. Summer progressed, bringing long days of ranch work and evenings on the porch watching fireflies rise from the grass. Despite her intentions to remain detached, Cassidy found herself increasingly woven into the fabric of ranch life. She began accompanying Margaret to church on Sundays, gradually meeting other families from the area. She started a small vegetable garden behind the kitchen, with Alice as her eager assistant. Without quite meaning to, she was putting down tentative roots. Dawson remained a consistent, if somewhat distant, presence. Their interactions were largely confined to meal times and occasional evenings, when he would join the family for dinner. Yet Cassidy became increasingly aware of small kindnesses he performed without acknowledgement, carrying heavy flour sacks to the kitchen before she could struggle with them, fixing the loose step on the back porch, bringing fresh wildflowers that Alice thought might brighten the kitchen table. In early August, Silver Creek held its annual summer social, a gathering of ranching families from across the region. Margaret insisted Cassidy join them, overriding her protests about having nothing suitable to wear. Nonsense, Margaret declared, producing a lovely blue dress from her wardrobe. This should fit you perfectly. I made it last year before little Joseph arrived, and now I'm afraid my waistline will never be the same. The dress did fit beautifully, if a bit loosely around the waist. Standing before the small mirror in her room, Cassidy hardly recognized herself. It had been so long since she'd worn anything but practical work dresses. You look beautiful, Alice announced from the doorway, her own Sunday best freshly pressed. Like a fairy tale princess. Cassidy smiled, touching her carefully pinned hair self-consciously. Hardly a princess, Alice. But thank you. The entire Reynolds family, including Cassidy, traveled to town in the large wagon. Several other ranch hands followed on horseback, including Dawson, who rode slightly apart, his posture straight, as always. Silver Creek's main street had been transformed for the occasion. Lanterns hung from ropes strung between buildings, tables laden with food lined the boardwalks, and a small band played cheerful tunes in front of the hotel. Children darted between adults, couples danced in the cleared street, and the atmosphere was one of rare carefree celebration. Mrs. Benson, Jacob Porter greeted her warmly. Wonderful to see you looking so well. Life at Triple R agrees with you, I think. It's been a pleasant change, Cassidy admitted, surprised to realize she meant it. As the evening progressed, Cassidy found herself drawn into conversation with various townspeople. Many remembered her from her brief time in Silver Creek with Thomas, and expressed genuine pleasure at seeing her settled at Triple R. The sense of community was something she hadn't experienced since leaving Kansas. May I have this dance, Mrs. Benson? Cassidy turned to find Dawson Jenkins standing beside her, hat in hand. In his dark suit and crisp white shirt, he looked different from the dusty foreman she was accustomed to seeing. Handsome, she realized with a small jolt of surprise. I don't dance much, Mr. Jenkins, she demurred. Nor do I, he admitted. But it seems a shame to stand on the sidelines all evening when the music's so lively. Perhaps it was the festive atmosphere, or perhaps it was the quiet certainty in his blue eyes, but Cassidy found herself accepting his hand. As he led her to the dancing area, she noticed Margaret Reynolds watching with undisguised approval. Dawson proved to be a competent, if not flashy dancer, guiding her through the simple steps with the same quiet confidence he showed in everything. His hand was warm at her waist, respectfully placed but secure. I'm surprised to see you dancing, Cassidy said as they moved through the steps. You don't strike me as a man who enjoys crowds and celebrations. I'm full of surprises, Mrs. Benson, he replied, the hint of a smile playing at his lips. Though I admit, the company makes the crowd worthwhile. The compliment, subtle as it was, brought warmth to Cassidy's cheeks. You're being kind. I'm being honest, he corrected. That blue suits you. Brings out your eyes. Before Cassidy could formulate a response, the music ended. Dawson stepped back, his hand lingering briefly on hers before he released it. Thank you for the dance, he said simply. You're welcome, she replied, suddenly feeling awkward. If you'll excuse me, I should check on Margaret and the children. As she walked away, Cassidy was acutely aware of her racing heart. Dawson Jenkins was just being polite, she told herself firmly. The fact that his touch had affected her so strongly was simply because it had been so long since she'd danced with anyone. It meant nothing. Yet later that night, as the wagon rumbled back toward Triple R under a canopy of stars, Cassidy found herself watching Dawson's silhouette as he rode ahead. There was something about his straight-backed figure, outlined against the night sky, that spoke of steadiness and strength. He's a good man, John Reynolds said quietly beside her, following her gaze. Loyal to a fault. The kind who'd give you the shirt off his back without being asked, then refuse thanks for it. Cassidy looked away quickly. I wasn't, John chuckled. No need to explain to me, Mrs. Benson. Just making conversation. The following week brought the season's first cattle drive, taking many of the hands, including Dawson, away from the ranch. Their absence made the place seem strangely empty, the bunkhouse silent at mealtimes, the corrals vacant of the usual activity. Cassidy was surprised by how much she missed the routine, and if she sometimes found herself watching the horizon for returning riders, she told herself it was merely concern for the ranch's well-being. 10 days after their departure, the men returned, driving a new herd of cattle purchased from a ranch to the north. They arrived in the late afternoon, dust-covered and weary but successful. Cassidy, forewarned by one of the remaining hands who had spotted them from a distance, prepared a hearty welcome meal. She told herself the extra effort was for all the returning men, not anyone in particular. As the hands filed into the bunkhouse for dinner, Cassidy noticed Dawson's absence. When she asked, one of the younger cowboys informed her that the foreman was still checking the new herd, making sure they settled in the north pasture. Without quite planning to, Cassidy set aside a plate and wrapped it carefully. After the others had been served, she made her way toward the north pasture. The early evening was pleasant, with a soft breeze carrying the scent of sage and distant rain. She found Dawson exactly where the young hand had indicated, sitting on a fallen log overlooking the pasture, his horse grazing nearby. He looked up at her approach, surprise evident in his expression. Mrs. Benson, he greeted her. Is everything all right at the house? Everything's fine, she replied, suddenly feeling foolish for coming. I brought you dinner, since you missed it with the others. Something flickered in his eyes as she handed him the wrapped plate. That's very thoughtful of you. It's my job to feed the ranch hands, she said quickly, unwilling to acknowledge the other reasons she might have come. Dawson nodded, accepting her words at face value. Would you care to sit for a moment? It's a nice evening. Cassidy hesitated, then settled beside him on the log, leaving appropriate space between them. The cattle grazed peacefully in the pasture below, their forms dark against the golden grass. Successful drive? She asked. Very. Dawson confirmed between bites. Good strong stock. John got a fair price too. He glanced at her. How were things here while we were gone? Quiet, Cassidy admitted. Too quiet, actually. I've grown used to cooking for 20 hungry men. They've grown used to your cooking too. Haven't heard so many compliments about meals since I've been at Triple R. Cassidy smiled despite herself. Even after the pepper incident? Especially after that, Dawson said with a quiet laugh. Showed you were willing to try something new. Men respect that. They sat in comfortable silence as Dawson finished his meal. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the pasture. You didn't have to bring this out to me, Dawson said finally. But I'm glad you did. I wanted to, Cassidy admitted, surprising herself with her honesty. I missed the routine while you were all away. Dawson studied her for a moment. Just the routine? The question hung between them, more significant than its simple words. Cassidy felt her heart quicken. It's getting late, she said, standing abruptly. I should get back to the house. Margaret will wonder where I've gone. Dawson rose as well, his height making him seem suddenly close despite the space between them. I'll walk you back. There's no need, I insist, he said simply, gathering his horse's reins. They walked side by side in the gathering dusk, the horse following behind. Cassidy was acutely aware of Dawson's presence beside her, his stride measured to match hers, his occasional glances when he thought she wasn't looking. Have you given any more thought to your plans? He asked as the ranch buildings came into view. You mentioned leaving when you first came. The question caught Cassidy off guard. In truth, she had thought less and less about leaving as the weeks passed. Her savings were growing, enough now that she could likely make the journey east comfortably, but the urgency had faded. I'm not sure anymore, she admitted. Things have changed. Changed how? Cassidy chose her words carefully. I came to Triple R because I had nowhere else to go. I stayed because it was practical. But now, Dawson prompted when she trailed off. Now I stay because I want to, she finished quietly. At least for now. The smile that spread across Dawson's face transformed his features, softening the usual seriousness. I'm glad to hear that, Mrs. Benson. Very glad indeed. At the kitchen door, Dawson paused. Thank you again for dinner. And the company. You're welcome, Cassidy replied, suddenly shy under his direct gaze. Perhaps he began, then stopped himself. Good night, Mrs. Benson. Good night, Mr. Jenkins. As summer gave way to autumn, the relationship between Cassidy and Dawson evolved in subtle ways. Their conversations became more frequent, lingering beyond what was necessary for ranch business. He began bringing her wildflowers regularly, no longer attributing them to Alice's suggestions. She found herself preparing his favorite dishes more often, taking particular satisfaction when he complimented her cooking. Yet both maintained a careful distance, neither quite ready to acknowledge what was developing between them. The harvest season brought new busyness to the ranch. Cassidy found herself preserving fruits and vegetables for the winter months, while the men brought in hay and prepared the herds for the colder weather ahead. One crisp October morning, Margaret approached Cassidy as she kneaded bread dough. John and I need to go to Helena for a few days. His brother is ill, and we should see to him. Would you mind terribly looking after the children while we're away? Of course not, Cassidy assured her. Alice and I will manage just fine with the boys. Margaret smiled gratefully. Dawson will be here to oversee the ranch, of course. He's practically family anyway. The 4 days of the Reynolds' absence passed in a whirlwind of activity. Between caring for the children, particularly active 4-year-old Robert and baby Joseph, and maintaining her usual cooking duties, Cassidy barely had time to breathe. On the third evening, after finally getting all 3 boys to sleep, Alice being old enough to manage herself, Cassidy collapsed onto the porch swing, exhausted but pleased with managing so well. They finally surrendered to sleep? Dawson's voice came from the darkness. He stepped onto the porch, 2 steaming mugs in his hands. Complete surrender, Cassidy confirmed with a tired smile. Though Robert made me read the same story 3 times before he'd close his eyes. Dawson handed her one of the mugs. Thought you might need this. Coffee with a splash of something stronger. Ranch hand remedy for exhaustion. The warm mug felt wonderful in her hands. Thank you. I didn't realize children could be so constant. You're doing admirably, Dawson said, settling beside her on the swing. They adore you, especially Alice. She told me yesterday she wants to be just like you when she grows up. Warmth that had nothing to do with the coffee spread through Cassidy's chest. She's a special girl. They sat in companionable silence, the swing moving gently beneath them. Stars blazed overhead in the clear autumn sky, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its pack. This is nice, Cassidy said softly, almost to herself. It is, Dawson agreed. After a moment's hesitation, he added, it could be like this more often, you know. Cassidy turned to look at him, uncertain of his meaning. His face was half-shadowed in the dim porch light, but his eyes were intent on hers. What do you mean? She asked. Dawson seemed to choose his words carefully. I mean that this evenings like this they don't have to be rare occurrences. Cassidy's heart quickened. Mr. Jenkins, Dawson, he corrected gently. After all this time, I think you could call me Dawson. Dawson, she repeated, the name feeling strange and intimate on her tongue. I'm not sure what you're suggesting. He set his mug down on the porch railing, turning more fully toward her. I'm suggesting that I've come to care for you, Cassidy. More than I expected to when I first offered you that job. More than might be wise, given your original plans to leave. The directness of his words startled her. You don't need to respond right now, he continued quickly. I know you've been through much, losing your husband, nearly losing everything. I know trust doesn't come easily to you. I'm a patient man. I can wait. Before Cassidy could formulate a response, baby Joseph's cry rang out from inside the house. She stood quickly, nearly spilling her coffee. I should go to him, she said, flustered by both Dawson's declaration and the timing of the interruption. Dawson nodded, understanding in his eyes. Of course. Good night, Cassidy. Good night. Dawson. Inside, as she rocked Joseph back to sleep, Cassidy's thoughts whirled. Dawson Jenkins cared for her. If she were honest with herself, she had suspected as much for weeks now. The question that troubled her was not whether he cared, but whether she could allow herself to care in return. Thomas's death had left her more than widowed. It had left her wary of depending on anyone again. The pain of loss was still a dull ache she carried within her, not for Thomas himself perhaps, but for the security and future she had thought was certain. When Margaret and John returned the following day, life at Triple R resumed its normal rhythm. If Dawson was disappointed by Cassidy's lack of response to his declaration, he showed no sign of it. He remained the same steady, quietly attentive presence he had always been. Yet something had shifted for Cassidy. Now that his feelings were spoken aloud, she found herself watching him more closely, noticing the gentleness with which he handled the horses, the patience he showed the younger ranch hands, the respect he commanded without raising his voice. As November arrived, bringing the first dusting of snow to the mountains, Cassidy made a decision. She had been at Triple R for nearly 4 months longer than she had initially planned. It was time to decide whether to continue east as she had originally intended, or to acknowledge that her life had found a new direction. On a Sunday afternoon, while the Reynolds family visited neighbors, Cassidy sought out Dawson. She found him in the barn, repairing tack with the same methodical care he brought to all tasks. "May I speak with you?" she asked from the barn doorway. He looked up, surprise giving way to pleased welcome. "Of course. Coming out of the cold." Cassidy stepped into the warmth of the barn, the familiar sense of hay and leather surrounding her. She had rehearsed what to say, but now, facing him, the words scattered. "I've been thinking about what you said," she began hesitantly. "About caring for me." Dawson set aside his work, giving her his full attention. And I'm afraid," she admitted, the honesty surprising even her. "When Thomas died, I lost everything. Not just him, but our home, our future, everything we'd planned. I'm afraid to build something new that could be taken away just as quickly." Dawson listened intently, his eyes never leaving hers. When she finished, he stood and moved toward her, stopping at a respectful distance. "Life offers no guarantees, Cassidy," he said gently. "I can't promise nothing bad will ever happen, but I can promise that whatever comes, you wouldn't face it alone. Not as long as I draw breath. How can you be so sure? She asked. You barely know me. A small smile touched his lips. I've known you for 4 months. I've watched you rebuild your life from ashes, seen your strength and your kindness. I know enough. He took a careful step closer. I'm not asking for an answer today. Just, don't leave without giving us a chance. That's all I ask. Something in his quiet certainty soothed Cassidy's fears, not eliminating them, but making them seem less overwhelming. I won't leave, she promised softly. Not yet. The weeks leading up to Christmas brought a festive atmosphere to Triple R. Margaret and Cassidy decorated the main house with pine boughs and red ribbons, while the children created paper chains and ornaments for the small tree John brought from the foothills. Cassidy threw herself into the preparations, baking traditional cookies and helping Alice sew simple gifts for her brothers. The activity kept her busy, but in quiet moments, her thoughts returned to Dawson and the future she was beginning to imagine might be possible. Their interactions remained proper but warmer, with shared smiles and lingering glances. On evenings when Dawson joined the family for dinner, Cassidy found herself seated beside him more often than not, their conversations flowing easily from ranch matters to childhood memories to books they had both read. 3 days before Christmas, a blizzard descended on the region with startling speed. What began as gentle snowfall in the morning had become a howling white nightmare by afternoon. The ranch hands secured the animals and hurried to the safety of the bunkhouse, while John Reynolds ensured his family was safely gathered in the main house. Dawson's still out checking the north pasture fence, John reported grimly as he stomped snow from his boots in the kitchen. Said he saw tracks suggesting some cattle might have broken through before the storm hit. Margaret exchanged a worried look with Cassidy. Surely he'll turn back now? The storm's getting worse by the minute. He knows what he's doing, John assured her, though concern lined his face. Dawson's weathered worse. As darkness fell, the storm intensified. Wind rattled the windows, and snow piled against the doors. The children, sensing the adults' worry, were unusually subdued as they prepared for bed. Will Mr. Dawson be all right? Alice asked Cassidy as she tucked the girl into bed. Of course he will. Cassidy replied with more confidence than she felt. He's very smart and very careful. But as the evening wore on with no sign of Dawson, Cassidy's worry grew. She found herself pacing by the kitchen window, straining to see through the swirling snow. By midnight, even John had begun to show serious concern. If he's not back by first light, I'll take some men and search, John told Cassidy when he found her still in the kitchen past midnight. Try to get some sleep. Dawson may have decided to shelter in one of the line cabins. But sleep was impossible. Cassidy lay awake listening to the storm, imagining Dawson lost in the blinding snow or injured somewhere beyond help. The fear that clutched her heart made one thing crystalline clear. She cared for Dawson Jenkins far more deeply than she had been willing to admit, even to herself. Just before dawn, when the storm had finally begun to abate, Cassidy heard movement on the back porch. She rushed from her room, still in her nightdress with only a shawl hastily thrown over her shoulders. There, stomping snow from his boots, was Dawson. Ice crusted his beard and eyebrows, and exhaustion lined his face, but he was gloriously, wonderfully alive. Dawson, she cried, forgetting all propriety in her relief. He looked up, surprise giving way to warmth as he recognized her. Cassidy, I'm sorry to wake you. Wake me? I haven't slept a wink, she admitted, hurrying to help him remove his frozen coat. We were all so worried. Where have you been? Found 6 head of cattle trapped in a ravine, he explained, his voice hoarse from cold. Couldn't leave them to freeze. Led them to the line cabin on the north edge, stayed there till the worst passed. His hands were like ice when Cassidy took them in hers. You're frozen through. Come, sit by the fire. I'll make coffee and something hot to eat. As she busied herself preparing food, Cassidy was intensely aware of Dawson watching her from his place by the stove, thawing slowly in the kitchen's warmth. You were worried about me, he said finally, his tone wondering. Cassidy paused in her work, meeting his gaze directly. Yes, more than I knew I could be. Something shifted in Dawson's expression, hope kindling behind the exhaustion. What are you saying, Cassidy? Setting down the pot she held, Cassidy moved to stand before him. I'm saying that I've been afraid to trust, afraid to care too deeply. But last night, thinking you might be lost in that storm. The fear of losing you was far worse than the fear of loving you. She took a deep breath. You told me once you were a patient man. You've shown me that patience, given me time and space to heal. And somewhere along the way, without my quite realizing it, you became important to me. More than important. Dawson rose slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. Are you saying what I think you're saying? I'm saying I love you, Dawson Jenkins, Cassidy said, the words both frightening and freeing. I don't know what the future holds, but I want to face it with you, if you'll still have me. For a man usually so composed, Dawson's response was startlingly swift. In one step, he closed the distance between them, gathering her into his arms with a tenderness that belied his strength. I have waited to hear those words, he murmured against her hair. I would have waited years more if necessary. When he kissed her, it was gentle at first, then deepening as she responded. All the feelings Cassidy had held at bay rushed forward: desire, hope, the sweet relief of finally acknowledging what had been growing between them for months. They broke apart at the sound of footsteps in the hallway. John Reynolds appeared in the doorway, clearly prepared to join the search for his foreman. His expression shifted from determination to surprise, then knowing satisfaction as he took in the scene before him. I see our lost sheep has returned, he said with barely suppressed amusement, and found quite the welcome. Cassidy felt heat rise to her cheeks, but Dawson kept one arm firmly around her waist. John, he said with unusual formality, I should inform you that I intend to court Mrs. Benson properly, with the hope that she might eventually agree to be my wife. John's smile broadened. About time you came to your senses, both of you. Margaret will be delighted. She's been planning this match since July. Christmas at Triple R that year was particularly joyous. The blizzard left behind a pristine white landscape and clear blue skies. The house rang with laughter as gifts were exchanged and stories shared. But for Cassidy, the greatest gift was the certainty that had replaced her doubt, the belonging that had replaced her isolation. Dawson, true to his word, courted her properly in the months that followed. They took Sunday rides together, chaperoned at first by Alice, who considered their romance the most exciting thing to happen at Triple R in her memory. They exchanged letters even though they saw each other daily. Dawson, revealing a poetic side Cassidy hadn't suspected, she responding with growing openness about her hopes and fears. By spring, when the first wildflowers began dotting the valleys, Dawson formally asked Cassidy to marry him. The proposal came during one of their Sunday rides, at a spot overlooking the entire Triple R spread, with mountains rising majestically in the distance. I know it hasn't been quite a year since you came here, Dawson said, holding her hands as they sat on a sun-warmed rock. If you need more time, I understand. But I love you, Cassidy Benson, and I want to build a life with you. Will you marry me? Cassidy looked out over the land that had become her home, then back at the man who had patiently shown her how to trust again. Yes, she said simply. With all my heart, yes. They were married in May 1879 in Silver Creek's small church. Margaret had insisted on sewing Cassidy a proper wedding dress, and the entire community turned out to celebrate. Jacob Porter walked Cassidy down the aisle, proudly serving as the father figure she had lost years before. As they exchanged vows, Cassidy thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. From desperate widow to reluctant cook to beloved bride, a transformation she could never have imagined that dust-filled day when the bank took her homestead. I now pronounce you husband and wife, the minister declared. As Dawson kissed her, sealing their vows, cheers erupted from the assembled guests. The celebration continued at Triple R, with tables set up under the trees and lanterns strung from branches. As the sun began to set, casting golden light across the gathered community, Dawson led Cassidy away from the festivities for a moment of privacy. Happy, Mrs. Jenkins? He asked, his arms encircling her waist. Happier than I ever believed possible, she assured him. And grateful. Grateful. Cassidy nodded, her eyes meeting his. For your kindness when I was determined to refuse it. For your patience when I was afraid to believe in new beginnings. For loving me enough to wait until I was ready. Dawson's smile held all the warmth of the setting sun. I would have waited forever for you, Cassidy, but I'm mighty glad I didn't have to. As they rejoined their celebration, Surrounded by the community and family that had become theirs, Cassidy reflected on the unlikely path that had led her to this happiness. Life offered no guarantees. Dawson had been right about that, but facing whatever came together made all the difference. In the years that followed, Triple R prospered under John Reynolds and Dawson Jenkins' management. When John eventually retired, he sold half the ranch to Dawson and Cassidy, allowing them to build their own home on the property while remaining part of the extended family they had become. Their first child, a daughter named Elizabeth, arrived a year after their marriage, followed by twin boys 2 years later. The kitchen of their new home became the heart of their family life, filled with the same warmth and welcome that had first begun to heal Cassidy's wounded heart. On their 5th wedding anniversary, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset after the children had been put to bed, Dawson took Cassidy's hand in his. "Do you ever think about what might have happened if you hadn't taken that job as cook?" he asked. "If you'd gone east as you planned?" Cassidy considered the question. "Sometimes. But then I look at our children, at the life we've built, and I can't imagine any other path." "I knew the first time I saw you in Porter's store," Dawson confessed. "Something told me you were supposed to be part of my life. Even when you looked at me like I was the last person you'd ever trust." Cassidy laughed softly. "I was so determined to refuse help, to depend on no one. And I was equally determined to show you that accepting help isn't weakness," Dawson replied, kissing her hand. "Some things are worth being patient for." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Cassidy rested her head on her husband's shoulder, content in the knowledge that her heart had finally found its home not in a place, but in the steady love of a patient man who had believed in her even when she couldn't believe in herself. From reluctant widow to beloved wife, from isolation to family, from fear to love, Cassidy's journey had come full circle. And in the strong arms of Dawson Jenkins, she had found not just a second chance, but a life more joyful than she had ever dared to dream.